The cemetery was silent, except for the soft rustle of leaves in the breeze. But silence can be deceptive. It can carry echoes of pain, of unanswered questions, of lives cut short, and that morning, silence held something darker. On the cold ground near a gravestone, a man's body was found. His name was Dono, a well-known rapper, an artist who had painted his story not only with words but also across the walls of his city. But here, he lay still. His life ended in the very place where his son rested. Imagine that, a father collapsing in front of his child's grave, as though even death had chosen to meet him where grief had already broken him. This was no ordinary scene. Witnesses later described the eerie contrast. A man celebrated for his voice, his rhythm, his fight, now silenced forever at a place of mourning. People asked, was it fate? Was it coincidence? Or was it something darker, revenge, betrayal, or unfinished business? And that's where our story begins. To understand what brought Dono to this chilling ending, we need to rewind to his beginnings, to the rise of a man who carried music in his soul and a city's stories on his shoulders. A man whose fame grew, but whose private battles never left him. Because behind every artist's stage lights, there are shadows. And Dono's were heavy. He wasn't just a rapper. He was a son, a father, and a dreamer who painted murals that turned concrete walls into living canvases. Born and raised in Naples, Italy, his voice carried the rhythm of his city, raw, powerful, and sometimes painful. His songs weren't polished commercial hits. They were stories of streets, of struggle, of survival. He carried the weight of a community that saw itself in his words. But while his art was celebrated, Dono's life was far from simple. Those close to him described a man split between two worlds: the world of music and color, and the darker world that often surrounded him. Like many who rise from the streets, he walked a fine line between fame and danger, between expression and confrontation. And then, tragedy struck in a way that no parent can truly recover from. Dono lost his son. The details remain clouded, painful, and deeply personal. But that loss marked him. It shaped everything he did afterward. Friends say he visited his son's grave often, sometimes staying for hours, sitting in silence, as though waiting for answers that never came. To him, the cemetery wasn't just a place of mourning, it was a place of connection, a space where he could still feel his son's presence. It's haunting to think that this very place of sorrow would later become his own final scene. But before we reach that point, we have to ask, who was Dono really, and why would someone want to take his life in such a symbolic, almost theatrical way? As his music career grew, so did his visibility. His murals spread across neighborhoods, his rap battles and tracks gained traction online, bringing him not just fans but also critics. Fame in the rap world is rarely without conflict. Rivalries, old grudges, street ties, all of these can linger beneath the surface. Some people celebrated Dono's rise, calling him the voice of his generation. Others saw him as controversial, a man who spoke truths too sharp, too raw, too uncomfortable. And still others whispered that his past and the company he kept could one day catch up with him. In the months leading up to his death, there were signs, small and fragmented, that something was brewing. He had grown quieter on social media. His music, once full of fire, carried more melancholy. His friends noticed his visits to his son's grave became more frequent, almost obsessive, as though he was carrying a weight he couldn't shake off. And then came the night before. Nobody knew it would be his last. What happened in those final hours before Donna was found lifeless? Did he know he was being followed? Did he sense the danger closing in? Or was he, in his grief, completely unaware that the end was so near? That morning at the cemetery, when passers-by discovered his body, shock rippled through Naples. News spread fast. The rapper, the artist, the grieving father was gone, but gone in a way that raised more questions than answers. Who had silenced him, and why here? Was it a message? A coincidence? Or the cruel irony of a man's two deepest battles, fame and grief, colliding in one final brutal moment? And perhaps the most haunting question of all: if grief had already claimed Donno's heart, did someone decide to finish the job? There's a lot more to this story that will leave you speechless. If you find it worth listening to, don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss the next part. To understand why Donno's life ended so violently, we have to step back into the world that shaped him. Naples, his home, was a city full of contradictions. Beauty and hardship walked hand in hand. On one corner, you'd find ancient churches, stunning architecture, and echoes of history. On another, you'd find poverty, struggle, and streets that raised people in ways no school ever could. Donno grew up with both worlds pressing on him. He wasn't born into privilege. His family lived modestly, working hard to stay afloat. Like many kids around him, Donno was pulled toward art and music as a way of escape, a way of telling the truth about the life he saw every day. He didn't rap for fame at first. He rapped to survive, to release the weight of his thoughts, to let people know they weren't alone. His voice wasn't polished, but it was raw, real, and unforgettable. He could turn the rhythm of the streets into lyrics that hit straight to the soul. When Donno performed, whether on a stage, in a battle, or just on a corner surrounded by friends, people stopped to listen. He wasn't just spitting rhymes, he was telling their stories. And in Naples, that meant everything. But Donno wasn't only about music. He had another gift: painting. Murals became his second voice. He could take an abandoned wall, cracked and forgotten, and transform it into something alive. Faces of people who had been lost, images of resilience, symbols of hope. His work carried messages that couldn't be ignored. Slowly, his art and his music built him a reputation, not just as a performer, but as a symbol. Yet fame is never simple. For every fan who lifted him up, there was someone who wanted to pull him down. The rap world thrives on rivalries, and Donno's unapologetic style made him both admired and hated. He didn't sugarcoat his lyrics. He spoke of corruption, betrayal, and the kind of struggles many preferred to keep in the shadows. Some saw him as brave, others saw him as dangerous, and then life struck him with its cruelest blow: the loss of his son. The boy was young, with a future still unwritten. Losing him shattered Donno. Friends recalled how his energy shifted. The man who once rapped with fire in his voice now carried a sadness in every word. His murals became darker, painted not just with color but with grief. His music, too, began to change. Tracks once filled with defiance now echoed with loss. He became a father grieving in public, his art an open wound for the world to see. And yet, Donno kept creating. He seemed to believe that through his art, he could keep his son alive in some way. His visits to the cemetery grew frequent, almost ritualistic. He would sit by the grave, sometimes talking, sometimes just staring, as if waiting for an answer. But here's where the story gets more complex. Dono's grief didn't make him untouchable. In fact, some believed it made him more vulnerable. A man drowning in loss is often less guarded, less careful, and for someone already walking the thin line between fame and danger, that vulnerability could become deadly. There were whispers, not all of them kind. Some said Dono had unfinished feuds. Others claimed he had gotten too close to people he should have stayed away from. In Naples, where music, art, and the street world often overlap, the line between friend and enemy can blur in ways outsiders don't understand. The weeks before his death seemed to carry a strange tension. Dono wasn't as present online. He didn't post as often, and when he did, there was a heaviness in his words. His music carried undertones of finality, as if he was preparing for something he couldn't quite explain. His friends worried, but Dono brushed off their concerns. To him, his only focus was his son's memory. But while he was looking back at the grave, someone else might have been watching him. That's the haunting part. Dono's routines were predictable. He visited his son's grave regularly, often at the same times. And predictability can be dangerous for a man with enemies. Did someone notice this? Did someone see his grief as the perfect trap? It's unsettling to think about, but many do. Was Dono lured into his own ending by the very place he went to heal? His fans didn't know any of this at the time. To them, Dono was still a fighter, a rapper who turned pain into poetry, a painter who gave voice to walls. But behind that public face, he was carrying a storm that only those closest to him could see. And so, as the days ticked closer to his final mourning, the tension grew, invisible but deadly. Dono may not have realized it, but the world around him was shifting. Old wounds were resurfacing, new threats were circling, and grief, which had once been his reason to live, may have become the doorway to his death. What's worse, that Dono didn't see it coming, or that he did, but accepted it as the price of the life he had lived. There's a lot more to this story, and the deeper we go, the more unsettling it becomes. If you want to keep following this path with me, don't forget to subscribe, because the next part will reveal the conflicts and rivalries that may have sealed Dono's fate. Okay, let's get the story going. Now we move on to part 1, where feuds, street tensions, and Dono's personal struggles collide, pushing him to the brink of collapse. By the time Dono's name was echoing through the streets of DC, he had already learned a hard truth. Fame might shine a light on you, but it also paints a target on your back. In the rap world, respect is currency. And Dono, with his raw delivery and no-filter lyrics, demanded it. He wasn't the type to back down, and his words cut deep. That made him magnetic to fans, but dangerous to rivals. Some thought he was too bold, too direct in calling out the things others preferred to whisper about. One of the earliest signs of this came during a notorious night at Stadium nightclub. What started as a performance ended in chaos. A brawl broke out, fists flying, voices shouting, and Dono was right in the middle of it. Word spread quickly. He had clashed with none other than members of the popular rap group Migos. For Dono, it wasn't about fame or clout. It was about pride. In his world, showing weakness wasn't an option. The headlines painted him as a troublemaker. But to his community, he was real, authentic, the kind of rapper who wasn't scared to stand his ground. Yet behind the bravado, the incident marked a turning point. Dono's name was no longer just associated with music and murals. Now, it was linked with confrontation, with controversy, with danger. Still, he pushed forward. He dropped tracks like Lego Me, which exploded in his neighborhood, becoming an anthem. On the surface, Dono was unstoppable, a rapper on the rise, an artist with walls across the city carrying his signature. But success didn't erase the shadows following him. As much as the streets celebrated him, they also whispered about him. Some accused him of stepping on toes, others of refusing to play the political games that come with rising fame. Dono didn't fit neatly into anyone's box. He wasn't just an artist. He wasn't just a rapper. He was both. And he was real in a way that made some uncomfortable. But the biggest battle he faced wasn't on stage or in the streets, it was in his home. When Razik was diagnosed with cancer in 2021, Dono's world shattered. He had always carried himself with a certain strength, a toughness that shielded him from the worst of life. But this was different. No amount of fighting, no lyrics, no murals could protect his little boy. For months, Dono put his career on hold. He became a full-time caregiver by his son's side through chemotherapy, hospital visits, and sleepless nights. The tough rapper image melted away in those hospital hallways. To nurses, he wasn't Big Boss Dono. He was just a father, clutching his son's tiny hand, begging silently for more time. On Instagram, he showed glimpses of his pain. Posts filled with hope, despair, and vulnerability. "I try to stay strong," he admitted. "But I cry when nobody's watching." Those who knew him said it was the first time they saw cracks in his armor. But cracks, once they appear, only grow. When Razik passed away in January 2024, it was as if someone had stolen Dono's soul. He still rapped, still painted, still smiled for pictures, but those closest to him knew it wasn't the same. His art grew darker, his lyrics heavier. He spoke of loss, of betrayal, of endings. It was grief, raw and unfiltered. And yet, even in that pain, Dono's world didn't pause. Old rivalries still lingered. Whispers in the city grew louder. Some said Dono was too open about his struggles, that vulnerability made him an easy target. Others thought his growing fame had brought jealousy, resentment, even danger. The truth is, grief can cloud judgment. It can make you reckless. And Dono's grief was a storm no one could calm. He began spending more time alone, more time at the graveyard where his son lay. Friends begged him not to isolate, but he waved them off. For him, Razik's grave wasn't just a resting place, it was an anchor, the only place he felt close to his boy again. But here's the chilling thought. Grief made his movements predictable. Anyone who wanted to find Dono knew exactly where to look. Was it coincidence that his final day was spent there? Or was someone watching, waiting, choosing that moment? We may never know for certain, but what we do know is that Dono's life was no longer his own. Fame, grief, rivalry, and love had all intertwined, pulling him closer to a breaking point. And on the 21st of July 2025, the world would learn just how devastating that breaking point would be. But the question remains, was Dono's end truly his own choice? Or did someone help push him there? There's much more to uncover, and the next chapter will bring us face to face with the haunting details of Dono's last days. If you've stayed with me this far, don't forget to subscribe, because what comes next will leave you questioning everything you thought you knew about this tragedy. The trial was approaching, and with it came an overwhelming storm of emotions. In the courthouse, the air felt heavier than the walls could bear. Reporters crowded the steps outside, their cameras flashing relentlessly as if each click could somehow capture the weight of the tragedy. Inside, the victim's family sat quietly, their grief etched into every line of their faces. They didn't want a spectacle. They wanted justice. The prosecution was ready. Piece by piece, they began to lay out the story, a chilling narrative backed by evidence that stripped away every excuse the defense might try to build. The jury listened as detectives described the crime scene, the way the body had been hidden, the cold calculation behind every step. Photos were shown, carefully, respectfully, but they carried a brutality no one in that courtroom could forget. And then came the timeline. Prosecutors outlined the suspect's movements, the lies he told, the way he tried to maintain a facade of normal life while carrying a terrible secret. Jurors shifted in their seats, the unease in their eyes betraying their thoughts. How could anyone live like that, knowing what they had done? The defense fought back, of course. They painted him as troubled, misunderstood, a man with flaws but not a monster. They spoke of difficult childhoods, of poor mental health, of a moment of weakness. But with every word, the prosecution countered with cold, undeniable fact. This wasn't a mistake. This wasn't an accident. It was a deliberate act, and the evidence proved it. Witnesses took the stand, each one adding another brushstroke to the portrait of guilt. Friends who recalled odd behavior, neighbors who noticed strange noises, a co-worker who remembered seeing scratches on his arms. And then, perhaps the most devastating testimony of all, the medical examiner, who spoke with clinical precision about what the victim had endured. Her words were steady, professional, but the horror behind them was undeniable. The courtroom fell silent, the family clinging to one another, the jury visibly shaken. For the first time, the accused looked unsettled. He had sat through much of the trial with an expression that hovered between arrogance and indifference. But as the weight of testimony grew heavier, cracks began to show. His eyes darted nervously, his jaw tightened, his hands clenched the table before him. Perhaps for the first time, he understood. There would be no escape. Outside the courtroom, the world followed every detail. The case had captured national attention, and the public was divided between sorrow for the victim and disbelief that such cruelty could exist. Social media buzzed with outrage. People demanded answers. How could this happen? And how many warning signs had been missed? But inside, the focus remained on the truth. The victim's story was being told, not just as a case file, but as a life, a person who laughed, who dreamed, who loved, and who deserved so much more than to be remembered only for her death. Her parents spoke softly when interviewed, not of anger, but of love. They wanted the world to know who she was, not just what had been done to her. And as the trial entered its final stages, the question hung in the air like a storm cloud. Would the jury see the truth as clearly as the evidence showed it? Would justice finally be served? Or would this case join the tragic list of crimes where punishment never truly fit the pain inflicted? The answer was coming. Everyone in that courtroom could feel it. The tension was unbearable, like the moment before a thunderclap, and in those heavy, quiet hours, the victim's family clung to hope that their daughter's voice, silenced so cruelly, would finally be heard through the verdict. The jury deliberated for hours that felt like days, Each tick of the clock echoed in the silent courthouse halls, a reminder that lives hung in the balance. Families waited anxiously, pacing floors worn smooth by nervous footsteps. Some prayed, others simply stared into the distance, their faces pale with exhaustion. The victim's parents sat together, holding hands so tightly their knuckles turned white. They had come this far, but would justice finally arrive? When the jury filed back into the courtroom, all eyes turned toward them. Their expressions were grave, heavy with the weight of responsibility. Everyone rose as the judge re-entered, the sound of the bailiff's command slicing through the tense air. Then, silence. The foreperson stood. In a steady but subdued voice, they read the verdict. Guilty on all counts. Gasps filled the room. Some cried quietly, others bowed their heads in relief. The victim's mother clutched her chest, tears streaming down her face, while her father finally let out the breath he had been holding for what felt like years. Across the aisle, the accused sat rigid, his face drained of color. The mask of confidence he had worn throughout the trial had shattered in an instant. The judge's gavel struck, sealing the decision. The man who had stolen a life would now lose his own freedom. Sentencing would follow, but the outcome was clear. He would never walk the streets again. For the victim's family, the verdict was both a victory and a cruel reminder of their loss. Justice had been served, yes, but nothing could bring their daughter back. Reporters swarmed outside, their microphones ready to capture raw emotion, but the family refused to turn the moment into spectacle. Their words were simple, heartfelt. We are grateful, but our hearts will never heal. As news spread, the community exhaled a collective sigh of relief. Strangers who had followed the case felt a connection to the young woman they never knew. Moved by her story and devastated by her fate, vigils were held in her honor, candles flickering in the night like tiny beacons of resistance against darkness. Her face appeared in murals, on posters, in tributes that declared she would not be forgotten. Inside the prison where he awaited sentencing, the convicted man was now just another number. Stripped of the arrogance that once defined him, he sat alone in a cell, his future nothing but gray walls and endless time. Yet questions lingered. Did he feel remorse? Did he ever truly grasp the enormity of what he had done? Or was he destined to remain a man incapable of empathy, consumed by the same coldness that had led him here? The sentencing hearing came swiftly. Victim impact statements were read aloud, raw, unfiltered grief that filled the courtroom with tears. The victim's best friend spoke of birthdays that would never be celebrated, late-night talks that would never happen again. Her mother described the hollow ache of a house that felt too quiet, too empty. Each word was a knife, cutting through the air with painful truth. The judge listened, his face solemn. And then came the final pronouncement. A life sentence without the possibility of parole. The courtroom erupted once more, some relieved, others heartbroken all over again. Justice, in the legal sense, had been delivered. But in the deeper sense, the sense of a stolen future, of a world without her laughter, it felt impossible to say justice could ever truly exist. The family walked out of court with dignity, but also with the knowledge that every day forward would be marked by absence. And yet, even as the gavel struck for the last time, one haunting thought lingered in the minds of many. What truly creates a person capable of such darkness? Was it something broken from birth? Or a series of choices that spiraled beyond repair? The case was over. But the questions were only beginning. The story doesn't end here. There's one final chapter that will leave you questioning everything. If you've made it this far, don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss the next installment. When the courtroom doors finally closed on the trial, silence returned. For weeks, those halls had echoed with testimony, tears, and sharp exchanges between lawyers. Now they were empty, but the weight of what had unfolded lingered in every corner. Outside, life resumed its usual rhythm. Cars honked in traffic, children laughed on playgrounds, and people went about their routines. But for the victim's family, time moved differently. Every moment was measured against the absence of the person they had lost. Dinner tables felt incomplete, family gatherings quieter. Holidays once filled with laughter and warmth were now heavy with a shadow that never lifted. Her bedroom remained untouched. Clothes hung in the closet. A favorite book still lay on the nightstand. The bed neatly made as though she might return any moment. Her mother sometimes found herself standing in the doorway, staring, caught between grief and denial. "I keep expecting to hear her footsteps," she whispered once to a friend. But the silence is deafening. The trial's outcome had brought a form of closure, but grief doesn't follow courtroom schedules. It lingers. It evolves. It shapes the lives of those left behind. The father, once a pillar of strength, now found himself breaking down in unexpected moments at the sight of her old bicycle, or when a song she loved played on the radio. Grief, he realized, is not a wound that heals, but one you learn to carry. For the community, the case became a cautionary tale, a reminder of how fragile life can be, and how darkness sometimes hides in plain sight. Candlelight vigils became annual events, not just to remember her but to remind everyone to look out for one another. Friends, neighbors, even strangers promised to keep her memory alive by speaking her name, by telling her story. The convicted man faded into obscurity behind prison walls. Occasionally, his name surfaced in news updates, but he was no longer the center of the narrative. The world had turned away from him. Instead, it focused on her, the victim who had been silenced but whose memory refused to disappear. In the years that followed, her story sparked change. Campaigns for safety, for awareness, for justice reform were inspired by her case. Schools and organizations used her story as a way to teach young people about trust, caution, and resilience. Her name became more than a headline. It became a symbol, a rallying cry for those who refused to let tragedy define them. But there were darker echoes too. For some, the case stirred fear. Parents grew more protective, communities more suspicious. The idea that someone capable of such cruelty could live among them unsettled many. And the question that refused to fade was the one that haunted psychologists, criminologists, and ordinary people alike. What truly creates a killer? Was it nature, nurture, a broken mind, a broken heart, or something no one could ever fully understand? In quiet moments, the victim's mother wrestled with another tormenting thought: forgiveness. Could she ever forgive the man who had taken her child away? She wanted to believe in the power of forgiveness, but every time she tried, the image of her daughter's smile returned, and with it, the unbearable knowledge that she would never see it again. Her father, on the other hand, channeled his grief into action. He spoke at community centers, schools, and support groups, telling their story not as a tale of despair, but as a call to cherish life, to protect loved ones, and to never ignore warning signs. If sharing our pain can save even one life, he said, then she didn't die in vain. Years passed, but the memory of that trial, that verdict, and that loss never faded. Each anniversary brought flowers, candles, and tears. The community continued to gather, standing shoulder to shoulder, proving that while evil had tried to destroy, it had also strengthened bonds of love and resilience. The victim's name was etched into a memorial, a permanent reminder of a life cut short. Children grew up hearing her story, learning not just of her tragic end, but of her kindness, her laughter, her dreams. She lived on in memory, in the countless lives touched by her story, in the fight for justice that continued long after the courtroom lights dimmed. And yet, as the years stretched on, one question persisted, echoing in the hearts of all who had followed the case. Can justice ever truly exist when a life is stolen? The gavel may fall, the verdict may be read. But what of the empty chair at the dinner table, the birthdays uncelebrated, the future erased? The story ended with a sentence, but for those left behind, it will never truly end. Evil doesn't disappear after a verdict, it leaves behind echoes that last forever. If this story makes you think, don't forget to subscribe to join us in exploring more cases that reveal the darkest corners of humanity.